Kroger Delivery has one mission: to deliver the freshest food right to your door. That's why our drivers are pros. Our trucks are refrigerated. And when it comes to low prices, we always deliver. With $20 off your first order of $75 or more, there's no better time to get in on the action. Mission accomplished. Restrictions apply. See site for details.
The Athletic.
Untangling Formula One's latest cheating suspicions, tackling McLaren and Aston Martin's contrasting upgrade fortunes, revealing the opportunities and limitations of simulations, and exposing low-tech solutions. Gary takes on all this, as well as the question of if there's a better way on engine rules. Welcome to the Race F1 Tech Show. I'm Edd Straw and I am here with Gary Anderson, as always, ready to bring half a decade's insight of motorsport and Formula One to bear on what's been a fantastic season. Hello, Gary. Obviously, just had a triple header, plenty going on, plenty of technical intrigue and developments through all three of those races, in fact. So this season keeps on giving, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's always difficult to know because teams keep on developing and you never really know who's going to arrive with what until the event happens. I think the first of that triple header was when most people would have brought their last batches of kit to sort of improve the performance of the car. There will obviously be sort of circuit-focused updates between now and the end of the season again, but they'll probably in existence as such, in other words, wing levels and brake duct sizes and various bits like that. So I think we've seen what we've seen. It's obviously the last race in the wet was a different type of event. Brazil's always brings a bit of chaos. I remember back to 2003 when it brought more or less exactly the same chaos as we had on Sunday past. So, nothing changes. The track's been resurfaced, but it still has, because of its topography, it still gets rivers running across it here and there. Over time, they put some grooves across the track surface to help drain those rivers, but not actually sort of allow it to be on the track surface. So there was 4 or 5 millimeter wide groove, 10 mil deep, machined across the track in various areas, which did help quite a lot on the old track. But they seem to have done away with a lot of that this year, so I'm not quite sure why. But either way, we saw an interesting race because, as they say, wet weather becomes a bit of an equaliser, and the car is not as important. The car still needs to carry a good balance, but the downforce levels as such are not so critical, really, because, if the car's balanced nicely, you can drive it. In the wet, it's always sliding a bit. You don't get the high loading, the high braking forces and the high lateral forces, so the car becomes a bit more docile in the fact that in the wet. We don't really know what teams might have run wet setups. Now, wet setups aren't as much as they used to be, but more downforce never hurts in the wet. If you're really confident, maybe a little bit softer, a little bit higher, a little bit softer roll bars, all that sort of stuff. But anyway, the end result was that Max Verstappen and the Red Bull dominated again, as we've seen in 2022, 2023. That was the sort of Red Bull domination. But in reality, it was a Max Verstappen domination. So, it sort of shut the championship down, I think, as far as Lando Norris was concerned. But because he had a fairly poor race day. But it was an interesting race to see who made the right decisions and who didn't.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's one of those weekends where definitely the weather transformed it, because I think McLaren in the dry would have won fairly easily. So, there's lots to unpick from that race. So what should we delve into first from that weekend?
Well, yeah, you say there about McLaren, and they would probably have won easily if it had been dry. Up to race day, I suppose. They did show they were in pretty good condition. Their sort of latest development is sort of slightly different rear wing. Was interesting. I wouldn't have classified it as a major development. I would have classified it as focusing on a wing level and getting the most efficient package on the car that you could. And obviously, as we saw, Norris was on pole with it, in the wet, but Piastri was on pole in the dry sprint race. They were both up there nearly every session, so the car was obviously pretty good. They did run more downforce, or a different wing assembly for the race. So Norris's wet pole for the Grand Prix was with a higher downforce level. And he complained a bit in the race with that because he just didn't have the speed in the straight. It's a balancing act, to compromise, all of that stuff. I don't think him getting beaten was just down to the speed in the straight. Obviously, there was a bit of a lucky draw there with when the safety car came out and the race was red flagged. Because the three guys that finished first, second, third all got the advantage of fitting fresh tyres when the rest had all pitted. So yeah, that's the luck of the draw. That happens now and again. It's a bit of a daft situation, I think, really, in one little way. Being able to fit new tyres, under the safety car or under the red flag if everybody else has already done it. But it's there because of potentially carbon fibre tyre damage from an incident. That it's different whenever it comes to it being wet, because you're stopping the race because of conditions. Obviously, it was because of an accident, but that accident was caused because the conditions were deteriorating dramatically. So it was one of those sort of things. I thought at the time, whenever Leclerc pitted and put on a fresh set of intermediates, I thought that was the right thing to do. Obviously, the race being stopped, red flagged, was, changed that opinion, because at that point in time, he would have had better intermediates as the rain increased, whereas the people who didn't pit would have had worse intermediates as the rain increased. So I thought he was in a pretty good position, and there was going to be one more stop, probably, at some point in time anyway. So nothing lost by pitting a bit earlier, putting on a set of intermediates, getting back out there into the fray with tyres that would cope with a bit more water. Obviously, it didn't work out that way, because in those conditions they did stop the race, and probably rightly so. But anyway, it cost a lot of teams a lot of money. I think the worst was Williams, probably. I mean, those two shunts were massive, and also losing a position in the championship. We keep talking about Alpine benefiting by something like $50 million for their end result of second and third, moving up the championship. But for Williams, they've probably lost 15 million, as well as from losing a point in the championship, and the accident damage was horrendous. Those were two massive shunts. So anyway, that was it really. It's always difficult in those conditions to make the right decision, and you can be a hero afterwards, or you can go to zero very, very quickly. But I think the guys that deserve to be on the podium, that were on the podium, because they did a good job.
Yeah, it's the nature of the beast in those races. I will just, because you mentioned the red flag rule, we had a question in which I'll just chuck into this section rather than saving it to the end, because Thierry sent in a question where he asked about the red flag rules, and he said, I might be missing something obvious, but why don't they simply add a time penalty equivalent to the average full pit stop duration at that track? So the average drive time in and out of the pits plus tyre change time to anyone changing tyres under a red flag, and then take the restart with the updated order. So that's a way to, if you change your tyres under the red flag, modify the time loss. I guess you could come up with there is a notional pit stop time loss, although obviously it varies in the wet, because in fact that was one of the reasons why Leclerc lost a couple more places than they thought he was going to when he stopped, because the pit exit, which is quite long at Interlagos, once you get out of the speed limit zone, but it was very, very wet, so he was slower out of there. But that could be a way to allow for the tyre change for safety under the red flag, but without distorting the order too much. Yeah,
I mean, there's plenty of ways of doing it. I've sort of pushed for a long time to say, right, okay, if it's done during whenever you're running slick tyres in a normal race conditions, and you've got to run the two different slick compounds, then whatever you change under the red flag needs to be the same compound as what you had on the car before it. And that means, if you haven't done your compulsory pit stop or your compulsory pit tyre change, you still have to do it. And the same could be said in the wet. There's no reason to allow a team to change their tyres just because of red flag. If it's red flag because of the rain's heavy or because there's an accident, it's very easy to prove whether you've got a puncture or not. If you've got a cut tyre or you haven't got a cut tyre, the pressure would be in the tyre, and obviously there's lots of Pirelli people there and there's plenty of time to inspect the tyres. And there's no reason not to start restart the race again on the same tyres in the same position as what you finished it. And then you just got to do a pit stop at some point in time because it's necessary. So it's one of those sort of situations. I think there's lots and lots of ways of fixing it. You're right, Terry, in saying about adding in a pit stop time if you do change the tyres. Maybe that should be if you have to change the tyres because of damage, then so be it. But, the damage isn't your fault. So you need to think about it very carefully. I don't think it's right to have, as Lando Norris put it, the luck of the draw making up the race result, because you've got to try and eliminate that at some point in time. And I think most drivers would now push for the fact that you can't change the tyres during a red flag interlude. You have to find some other solution to it. So, but what happens if you come in, if it just buckets down in rain, everybody's on slicks. Somebody just done their compound change, and you haven't. It buckets down with rain, and you can't go out in slicks again. So there's lots of, you need options whenever those sort of things happen, I think, and it needs to be thought about long and hard, because no matter what you do, somebody will complain about it.
Yeah, and it'd be nice to reduce the impact of that, because obviously it affects the race. There was a good example in it, Yuki Tsunoda, who ran third for much of the first stint. He'd just been passed by Ocon, but the team was telling him to stay out, probably because of the concern about there being a stoppage or whatever. But Tsunoda judged the conditions right, and he called for wets and dived in, and that cost him in the end. And you end up with this kind of tension between gambling on there being a stoppage and actually a driver who makes the right call for the conditions getting punished. A few of them switched to wets. So it's a difficult one. Obviously, if you don't allow tyre changes, you could argue you penalise those who haven't stopped. So it's very, very difficult. And I say it all comes down to the fact that red flags are so common now, aren't they? We've had more red flags in the past 5 years and in the 70 years before that. So very, very difficult challenge. But interesting fortunes at both ends of the grid. You mentioned that famous win in 2003 with Jordan, but that team, as Aston Martin in Brazil, had a horrible weekend. They were all over the place, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can compare Aston Martin to McLaren. I think they're two sort of fairly comparable teams. They use the same power unit. They've got the facilities, the money to do the job fairly well. They've got more or less the same focus on life. So McLaren brought lots of developments all season long, all of them working pretty well. Yeah, for Norris, his pole position didn't turn out correctly in Brazil, but it was difficult circumstances, and as I say, he put on a higher downforce rear wing for the race, which he wasn't happy with, I think, or put it on for qualifying and the race. In qualifying it worked well, in the race it didn't. But all the other developments have been positive direction, whereas for Aston Martin, it's sort of been standstill. This came, I would have to say, it sort of came in the middle of 2022 in a way, and it sort of, they haven't recovered really. 2023 was very similar. They were quick to begin with, and then it fell away. And 2024, they never really got back to the same level of performance. And all year long, I suppose the developments they brought have been, I wouldn't say detrimental to the performance of the car, but they haven't improved the performance of the car. They haven't made it any better or any easier. It still seems to be a fight. Fernando Alonso, you can see on the odd occasion, he does have a car that he can sort of wring its neck on new tyres and qualify and do a pretty decent job. But come the race, it's backwards really, and that's whenever you lose the edge of the tyre, the bite of the tyre, and suddenly you're relying on basically the balance of the car itself, to keep a decent pace up, and that falls away dramatically. So my biggest worry, there's two worries really. they don't seem to show that they've got a handle on why they're not so good. And it's the same old deal. It's lovely to get faster and faster. But if you don't, you still need to get a handle on why, because next year's coming thick and fast. And you've got to prepare for next year very soon. And your baseline is what you've got now. And all this season has proved that they don't really understand how to make the car go quicker. There's nothing fundamentally different in these cars. It's not as though you can have massively different weight distribution or characteristics from the car. It's a bit of mechanical stuff as far as suspension, geometries, rising rate, etc. But it's dominated by aerodynamics, and it's dominated by the underfloor. And Aston don't seem to be on top of that at all. So it's going to be a tense period, because I don't think Lawrence Stroll is somebody who has a lot of patience. He doesn't look like somebody who has a lot of patience to me. So I'm pretty glad I'm not there at the minute, because I think some of the meetings in the office might be a bit heavy-handed. Yeah,
they've had all sorts of trouble this year because upgrades haven't been delivering what they expected, certainly in terms of characteristics. They've had a couple of different approaches with the floor that they've been chopping and changing between, and they said they tried to kind of merge that for the Austin floor they introduced, because they had a few different floor directions that one worked better in one type of condition, another in the other, and that Austin hybrid version didn't seem to work. And at one stage in Interlagos, they had pretty much a Suzuka spec floor, and Suzuka was April this year, and they had to jack the car up. In the sprint, in the dry, they were just killing the tyres, and even Joe overtook both of them in that race. So they were worse than Sauber there, and it's bouncing on the and reacting badly to the bumps. So it seems like that's one of the teams that's taken time to adapt to the demands of these regs, insofar as a lot of teams, McLaren were quite good on this, sort of to slightly change the way they've analysed their aero testing data to what works. And I think Aston Martin seems to have been a bit too focused just on the load numbers, rather than, as you always talk about, even before this rule change, how important the characteristics are. So that seems to me the key learning, that they need to switch the way they're working in order to start making consistent progress.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing I'd say is, if anybody watched the race on TV, they would see what the direction they should be heading in. The one thing we heard about Alonso at the end of the race was that he was hurting. His back was hurting, and the bumps were terrible, and Lewis Hamilton was very vocal about all that. Now, all of the drivers will probably have been complaining about the bumps on the track, but the one thing you saw on TV quite easily was the amount of rear suspension movement on the Ferrari. There's a lot of rear view camera on Leclerc's car, and you could see the suspension movement. Now, I think if you watched any of those cars that were complaining really about the bumps, you wouldn't have seen as much movement at all. But the movement's always there. The fact that the car movement you can control with the dampers, you damp it by definition of a damper. That's what it does. It damps it out a bit. But when it's in the tyre, it doesn't. You just get bouncing. And once the tyre starts bouncing, going over a bump, you probably get 4 or 5 oscillations before it sort of gets back in control again. Whereas if it's taken up in the suspension, you might get 1 or 2 oscillations before the damper gets control of it. And that's really the area you've got to get your aerodynamic package, the underfloor, to be able to accept that sort of amount of suspension movement without the centre of pressure shifting up and down, or the on-off switch of the downforce because of airflow separation in the underfloor. So that's the difficult part, because, as you say, it looks like Aston Martin have just been chasing the headline number as opposed to a drivable car. I think you need to have a drivable car. Now, Ferrari in Brazil weren't exactly exciting. They were not bad, but they weren't exactly the king of the team they were in Austin as such. So it's one of these things where you will get compromises at some circuits. We have to wait and see what the rest of the season's like. But I think one thing Ferrari have done is to build a more driver-friendly car now than they had before. And that means sometimes you have to give away the headline number, but just go for the consistency. And I don't think Aston Martin have really woken up to that yet, or somebody up top is putting pressure on that headline number, saying this is where we have to be. You have to have more downforce. The headline number is the thing that counts. And that's the you've got to change your plans a bit with that now. Drivability is everything.
Yeah, you can send yourself in the wrong direction just by focusing purely on the downforce number and how much you put on the car. The number of upgrades doesn't matter. It's the performance that actually counts. So, yeah, and I think 25 is going to be very important for them just in terms of getting on top of that, because although you can say obviously 26 is the key opportunity to take a leap forward, but all the processes and the way you work and everything, they apply to 25. So I suspect when Adrian Newey turns up, he'll take a quick look at where they are in 25 and a few shifts there that will help them before he's 100% on 26, which is obviously the main focus. But yeah, it's just one of those things, isn't it? When you look at Brazil, it's very, very easy just to slip out of a window where it's working in the wet, isn't it? And obviously Ferrari struggled with the low temperatures in the wet with the tyres, and yeah, there are a few drivers even you saw across teams, different teammates. One side of the garage was going quite well, the other wasn't. We saw some teams went backwards in the wet, like Ferrari, like Haas, and I wonder if the fact they've got the same suspension might be significant there in the way they work the tyres. But there are also two teams that are fairly gentle on tyres in terms of dry race stints. So there's always a trade-off, isn't there?
Yeah, there's always a trade-off all the way through the car as far as downforce levels, the mechanical setup you run, how you control the loads. The one thing that the wet does for you, though, is it, in its own right, it reduces your ride height. Now, the wet tyres are bigger than the slick tyres, but that's not really a consequence because they're bigger for everybody than the slick tyres. But the track being wet does in effect reduce your ride height. If you had a car that was set up for the dry and went out in the wet, effectively your ride height would be reduced that little bit. Your speeds is obviously reduced, all that sort of stuff. But there's a whole lot of things happen. So I think you need to sort of look very closely at it. But in general, in the dry we're talking about here, the Aston hasn't improved all year long. Some teams, as you say, get the tyres up to temperature quickly, some don't. Some are very good for tyre degradation, some aren't. So there's a solution through all that somewhere. And I think you need to do a lot of analysis on other cars and their general performance and their average performances over a run. There's lots and lots of data you can produce. And I think you'd learn from all of it. And I think Aston need to sort of sit back a little bit and say that no point in just looking at ourselves and keeping going in the way we are. There's another solution there somewhere that might just be better.
Yeah, and in terms of what you're saying about the ride height being reduced in the wet, so it's basically the static ride height is a little bit higher, but the actual functional moving car in corners ride height will be lower because of the speed reduction.
Yeah, I mean, the speed reduction will mean, the aerodynamic load's a bit less, so the actual car won't be pushed down quite so much, but the tyres themselves are more compliant. The wet tyres have to be a little bit more compliant because of the conditions. You want more feel from the tyre, so that although the tyre's a little bit bigger, the tyre will be a little bit softer, which in theory softens your suspension. So you've got to get everything working in harmony. Suspension stiffness and tyre stiffness have to go together, because if you lock the suspension up solidly, all the impacts would go into the tyre and you'd bounce your way around the track, a bit like what Lewis Hamilton says he's driving with Mercedes. If you had very, very high tyre pressures and lots of suspension movement, then the ride height would change dramatically. Aerodynamics would be very, very difficult. So it's a compromise between those two, and then you have again your compromise between the dry weather and the wet weather to come into play. But every team has the same challenges. You have to let that happen.
We'll move on to our main topic now, Gary, and a big talking point at Interlagos was the suggestion that some teams are messing about with the tyres, specifically having some fluid, probably water. There have been suggestions that it might be something a bit more extreme, but from what I've heard about where it's been seen and where it is, I think it has to be something a little bit more benign than that, so probably water. So very small amounts of fluid in the tyre, probably water, all about helping the way you cool the tyres. Some have suggested there's an advantage in pressure control, but plenty of others have said it would be a problem for the tyre pressure control. And obviously this has emanated from Red Bull. McLaren's one of the teams suspected of doing it. from every conversation I've had, nobody seems to be giving this one a great deal of credibility except the team that's raised it. But I guess we can talk about the basics of this. Hypothetically, there can be a value from doing that, and people have done that in some categories over the years, but clearly legal in Formula One. But what could be the positives and the negatives of that? How practical would it actually be to do that if it was legal?
Well, yeah, obviously Brazil was a race where it wouldn't have come into play much because there was enough water around to cool the tyres without having to get tricked with it. Yeah, one of the things about all this is, it stems a little bit from the Pirelli wanting to minimise the tyre pressures. The drivers then sitting in the middle of the pit lane on the way out to let the pressures drop down, the temperatures drop down at the same time. But the big thing is, you've got yourself a wheel, a metal aluminium wheel, and you got the tyre, and the tread of the tyre is a thing that you can overheat very quickly. So trying to dissipate some of that heat into the rim to keep the tyre a more equal temperature would in itself stabilize the pressures a little bit. The humidity inside the tyre would mean that you would have to be very accurate with how much fluid you were putting in there constantly to try to make sure that your pressures were under control. And at least it was going to be consistent from tyre to tyre. It might raise the pressures that little bit, but that would mean that, as long as you've got it controlled, when the tyre temperature, tread temperature went up to 120 or something degrees, and that liquid turned into vapor, that should transfer more temperature from inside the tyre to the rim, which might stop it from going higher than 120 degrees or whatever the number would be. So the potential's there for something to be done. I'm not saying by any means that anybody's doing it. I get a bit disappointed if anybody's beaten now, it's about trying to stick a knife in their back and saying you're doing something, outside of the regulations. And I don't think that always happens. I think sometimes you have to accept that, they've just maybe done a better job for that given circuit. And obviously it's one of those sort of situations where McLaren have come on strong and Red Bull have lost out. So a bit of finger pointing in that direction. The thing we've got to realise is that there's a lot of transfer of people from team to team. And I know that McLaren have people from Red Bull. If, either way, that sort of thing will get around somewhere because it's fairly blatant. Pirelli pump the tyres up with what's called dry air. It goes through big filters before it goes into the tyres to be as dry as practical. And Pirelli's system is the air that's put into every team's tyres. So everybody should have the same. And if you're letting that all out and doing it yourself in the garage, somewhere along the line that will get out, black and white. There's no way of hiding something as massive as that. And also the fact that you would need your control of the volume that put in each tyre to be really, really tight. So it's not just a simple thing like letting the air out and sticking on your compressor and pumping some air into it. It's a lot more involved in the system. But hypothetically, if you had it, you could probably stop the tyres or reduce the temperature climb in the tyre tread. But again, you'd have to be sort of packaging the car to suit that, because at the end of the day, you use the brakes to heat the rim, to heat the tyre, as well as you want the rim suddenly to cool the tyre. So it's a circle of events that I'm not sure you could really achieve that much out of it. For the headache it would cause you, I think you might just do your brain at some point in time trying to work out what was going on.
And it is a funny situation because it would be clearly illegal. There was a technical directive a few years ago making it very, very clear you couldn't adjust the amount of moisture in the gases in the tyre. And it's very funny when things get close in Formula One, isn't it? Because teams get very paranoid, and there will be rival teams who are adamant that Red Bull's bib adjuster was definitely used illegally, and it's ridiculous they've got away with it. And then you get Red Bull who clearly think people are doing this with the tyres and are convinced others are doing it. But then if you say, well, they thought you were doing this, oh, well, that's different. And you always get teams reaching for that. And in any motorsport category, actually, there is always that suspicion, isn't there? If you're winning, you're doing it clean. If anyone else is beating you, maybe they're cheating. That it's the nature of the beast. There's that paranoia. But this one was a strange one, given so few people seem to give it a great deal of credibility. It all seems to have emerged from somebody spotting some fluid when the tyre was being stripped. Obviously, Pirelli mount and unmount the tyres, and Pirelli have to, if the FIA asks them, Pirelli have to report to the FIA about it. So if they'd seen anything odd, that would have come up, because the FIA have been looking at it and they checked all the tyres after the sprint. So it just seems a particularly curious one, this one. And that's kind of what happens, isn't it, when you have a team that's struggling, as Red Bull have been doing, to understand. And I can kind of understand their suspicions when it comes to things like the wing flexibility, because that's always something that it is an inevitable grey area, because the rule says the bodywork has to be rigid, but it can't be. So there always has to be a certain allowable amount of flexibility. And a cynic would say, if you wanted to have a good championship fight and you thought a few teams were getting a bit further forward by pushing that a bit more, you might be a bit more relaxed on that. That I can understand. That's always been, well, for a long time, that's been there as a little bit of the game. But this would be, both the bib adjuster and this would be emphatically illegal. So it feels like people are sort of running away with things a little bit, at least in the absence of actual evidence. It's all indirect evidence. It's all inferring it from something they've seen or something existing. But you need the proof.
Yeah, I mean, I have to look back at any point in time where we've had a problem with tyre pressures, or one set being very different from the other, or whatever, or one tyre being very different from the other three. The thing is, when the tyre was stripped, I would have looked at it myself, and if you look inside the carcass of the tyre, you will see extra humidity. It's there's more dampness in there than on other tyres. I'm not saying it's wet. I'm not saying you could wash your hands in it or anything, but normally there's a chalk pit in there, sort of like it's a dry white dust as such, or a dry dust inside the tyre, and that would be gone. Maybe it's not like that nowadays, the tyre, but that would be gone, and there would be a damp feel to the tyre, and you could put that down to a tyre that had been left out when it rained outside or something. It had more humidity in it when it was fitted, and you don't need very much, but it does affect the pressures quite dramatically. Two given tyres, one completely dry and one having had a little bit of humidity in it, you could see 2, 3, 4 psi difference very quickly for the same tyre temperature. So, I'm sure there's ways of tracing it if it had happened, rather than just talking about it. And I'm sure that Pirelli and the FIA will have had a close look at some tyres, as you say, after the sprint race to see what was going on there. The sprint race wouldn't be the best example, because obviously it's a reasonably long race, but it's still quite a short race relative to the Grand Prix. So it's one of those sort of things where you need to focus on it a little bit over time, just to sort of see that you don't see a trend going through it somehow, that the tyres coming off X car always look a little bit more humid than the other ones, because once you take the tyre valve out, most of what's in there will come out with the air as well. So yeah, it just needs time to sort of analyse it rather than jump into any decisions. But I would doubt very much that any team would give themselves a headache of trying to make that work, but it could be proven wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think there's another thing going on here, in that inevitably the teams have more resources than those enforcing the rules. Obviously, the FIA technical department only has so much resource. There's only so much time to check cars over on the weekend and monitor everything. And I think sometimes there's also an element of, when this stuff gets out, it's partly just to make sure that the FIA is looking at it and watching out for it. So I do think we'll keep seeing this with the way things are working at the moment. It will be of value to any team that's suspicious to make sure it's out there, so that it's being looked at, which isn't the most elegant way of doing it, but it's very difficult in Formula One, isn't it? Because there's always the element of exploring grey areas, which is fine, and provided you can form a coherent argument for why something's legal, even if it's maybe not meant to be, that's fine. it does worry me when there's a little bit more of this outright cheating allegation, because, like I said, this tyre thing and the misuse, any setup adjustment under part for May would be emphatically illegal for me. I mean, maybe, who knows? Maybe if any of this is happening, someone's got an argument somewhere ready to go. But for me, it would be a step too far, and that's the thing in Formula One, isn't it? When it's in the grey areas, flexi wings, that kind of thing, that's fair game. That's part of it. It's how far do you want to push it? And I think McLaren were quite clever. They had it for those 3 races, Spa, Baku and Monza, where it's very useful. They probably knew it was going to get clamped down on, but it was legal when they used it, even though it would be now not acceptable. But when it strays into this, X is doing this, which would be wrong, well, it maybe goes a little bit too far, but that's just, I guess, there's the element of paranoia there. In the absence of evidence, that is, like you say, something could be happening, but all we've got at the moment is just suggestions and whispers behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean, it's the difference in, as you say, going over that grey area by accident or designing it to go over that grey area. You know, and obviously putting fluid in the tyres or the adjustable bib. I mean, that would all have to be designed to allow it to happen, as you know, the rear wing in the McLaren, if it was doing what it was doing, as you say. It was legal at the time. It's been clamped down on now. So, but I must say that I would hate to see things that are designed to allow you to push the limits, as opposed to it just happening by accident. That's it's a whole different deal to me altogether. So, yeah, let's hope this last batch of races is nice and clean. Everybody pats everybody in the back at the end of the season and congratulates the team that does the best job, and we see a good clean fight to the final checkered flag.
That's very, very optimistic, but it might happen now that the Drivers' Championship is pretty much done and dusted. That Verstappen's going to win that. The Constructors' Championship is still live. I think even with Red Bull's little mini revival, they're going to struggle to get back into that because they've got a second driver who's not contributing. So it's just going to be that McLaren versus Ferrari fight, which will be quite dramatic. Right, well, as always, in the final part of the podcast, we'll take listener questions. If you'd like to send in a question for Gary to take on anything technically or tangentially technical, it can be about modern F1, ancient Formula One, something related to Gary's history in motorsport, send it to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com, and we will try and get through as many as we can. We've got 4 questions in this episode, Gary. So the first one is from Mario Zarate, who says, I have good memories with Gary when he served as the chair of judges at the F1 in Schools World Finals in 2016, where I was a competitor. I'm working on my PhD in aerospace modelling and simulation, and I'd love to know your opinions on the state of this in Formula One nowadays. What do you think is the main weakness or pain right now? Or is there something you would be excited for simulations to improve? That's a very broad question, isn't it? There's a lot of simulation technology in Formula One, and with the ever-expanding use of AI and that kind of thing, and machine learning, all those subsets of AI, it's a very, very broad church.
It is indeed. Well, yeah, I enjoyed my time as chair of judges at F1 in Schools as well. I'm not doing it this year because it collides with something else that I'm doing, but I have done it for quite a few years, and it's great to see some of these young students coming through. And as you say there, Mario, you working on your PhD, I hope it all goes well for you, and you get yourself to do whatever you fancy doing in life. But going on to your question about simulation, I mean, the big thing about simulation, and I think where most teams have tripped up lately, is the fact that any simulation you're doing is only as good as the data you can put into it. And that data, with ground effect cars, that data is very hard to actually gather. Aerodynamic data gathered from the wind tunnel that you create your aero maps with for various ride heights, etc., doesn't exist, because you can't run the car where the car is running at. It's just too close to the ground, or if you do, you're taking a big risk in the wind tunnel trying to produce that data. And it will never be the same, because, when you see the cars moving, for example, just going to what Lewis Hamilton was saying about the bouncing, these cars will all suffer from some sort of aerodynamic stall underneath it. Now, whenever the bouncing starts to happen, you've got the car very close to the ground, something stalls, the car lets go, it regenerates the downforce again, comes back down. I mean, that's porpoising. The car just goes up and down. But basically, if you let the car hit the ground, which obviously Lewis was complaining about dramatically, if you let the car hit the ground, the car will react to that. It won't stay there. You lose the downforce, the car will bounce off the ground, so it will accelerate that underfloor flow. It just can't stay attached because the car's moving up in the air at the same time as it wants to stall, so you're making the stall even worse. So you get much, much more exaggerated movement on the car. So going to simulation, it's very, very difficult to put that in there. Whenever you hear the drivers talking about simulation, they don't sort of simulate the conditions that we had in Brazil, the different corner conditions with the weather, etc. So I think the simulation tools at the moment they're pretty decent for an overall global view of what things should do. But you've got to believe reality on top of the simulation. I always say you've got to have gut feel. Same with wind tunnel data. You've got to have a bit of a gut feel. If that last movement of the ride height dropping at that last 2 or 3 millimeters in the wind tunnel, if you have a separation problem that leads to a stall in the floor, that is going to be a lot worse when you get to the track. So you sort of have to look at that closely and make sure that you take that into account, that this could be happening. And I think what we hear from a lot of teams is that they put new bits on the car and they go to the track and their first statement is, we're seeing the forces that we thought we should see. There's no way. You're measuring this stuff on push rod load cells. You'll get a general picture. That's why you'll see teams doing aero running down the straight at 240 Ks or something to get loads in the push rod. But that's not going to be the same whenever you're doing 300 Ks and the car's bouncing and loaded up at 3G corner. It's going to be very different. So if you've got a development in the car that's going to give you 20 kilograms of downforce extra, and you go down the straight at 240 Ks on the push rods, the ride height's completely different from what it'll be at 300. So you'll measure your 20 Ks of downforce increase at 240 kilometers an hour, whatever, and you say, pat yourself on the back, isn't that good? It can be a completely different beast when you're in the middle of a corner pulling 3-4G. And again, the simulation, if you can't put the data into the simulator that gives you that true aero map, then it's such a waste of time. And that's why I keep talking about, as I say, a gut feel about stuff. So yes, there's a lot of improvement that can be done with simulation. It's not going to be easy with ground effect cars because it's really hard to get that data. But I'm sure they will improve over time, and it just needs more understanding, more brain power to try to create those theoretical aero maps, I suppose you might call it, that could be what's happening to the car as opposed to what you think is happening to the car, but actually it isn't.
And it's such an interesting area because we talk about simulation. Every tool is an approximation of reality, is it? And a model, and it's a simplification of the world. And the wind tunnel is a sort of a physical means to simulate what's happening in the real world, but it has its limitations. You've obviously got things like the driver in loop simulators, which everyone's familiar with. You also have hardware in the loop with some simulations where you're running certain pieces in harness with simulation. Then you get the pure simulations, which is number crunching. I guess probably the most famous one for people to understand will be the strategy simulations, which are the probabilistic ones, the Monte Carlo simulations that throw in variables to try and predict what's going to happen, and then you can get a percentage chance of what will happen. So it's very broad, but it seems to me that the big opportunity is in terms of getting more of these things interconnected, because reality is incredibly complicated. Everything is at play, and it's incredibly difficult to get all these things connected and the interplay between them. But that's presumably where the big opportunity is, whereby you get the more factors you can simulate in a meaningful way and combine, the more accurate things will get. But of course, the more factors you're simulating, the more complicated it is, because if you've got you've got error bars in everything, and those error bars stack up on top of each other, don't they? So there must be a huge amount of development going on in this in terms of teams and how they do things.
Well, there is, yeah. I mean, obviously, the more manpower you have focusing on these simulation tools, then the better you'll get it. But you were mentioning there about race simulations. I've always said that race simulation it's a living thing. There's 19 other cars out there that have got this package of simulation tools exactly the same, and you're all trying to achieve the same goal. So you can have the best simulation in the world at points that you've got to stop lap 25 and blah blah blah, and you stick to that. You have no idea what others are going to do until it happens. So at the end of the day, you've just got to be fluid. You've got to have a set of parameters that will allow you to understand that this is what I want to do. But when I get to there, if it's all okay, we'll hang on. We'll just wait and see what others do as well. And you have to look at lap times. You have to look at the driver might be complaining a bit about his car's it doesn't feel as good right now, and he's half a second quicker than everybody else. You're in pretty good shape. He might not feel that. He doesn't know he's half a second quicker than everybody else. But at the end of the day, it's a living thing, as I say. So you have to just make sure you keep your mind open. And I think on too many occasions I see that people don't keep their mind open. And I think George Russell's complaint this weekend in Brazil was, about them bringing them into the pits when he felt they should stay out because of the conditions, and there was going to be likely a safety car or a red flag. But the team overruled him and brought him in, and obviously, they paid the price for that. So he finished fourth, as he himself says. He was, the next car, as opposed to the three guys that got a free pit stop. So you need to be, open-minded. And the same, I think, with the simulation, as far as the car performance is concerned, certain things I think you can simulate. I think, a rear wing, for example, you could very easily optimize your rear wing setting for a given track as far as drag downforce is concerned. But when it comes to some of the other stuff, and I'll keep talking about the underfloor, if the underfloor has some characteristics that you can't measure in the wind tunnel, and you're feeding that data into the simulation tool, you will get the wrong answer. So you have to just make sure that you keep on thinking about it, as well as the human element's never that far wrong. But if you believe the answer in the bottom of an Excel sheet all the time without questioning it, you will, on many occasions, get the wrong answer. So there's a lot of ground to be made up in simulation yet, I think, before it could be a concrete tool.
The next question comes from Robin McPhee from the Isle of Man. I'm just listening to the episode after the US Grand Prix where Gary theorises that Red Bull's controversial bib adjustment mechanism could be something as simple as a wing nut in the cockpit of the car. That got me thinking about a question for the next episode. What is a surprisingly simple low-tech component or solution that can be found on a modern F1 car? This is a good question for you, Gary, I think, because there's some very good, simple, practical solutions you've used in your career, not on modern F1 cars for today, but you've got plenty of experience of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of stuff out there. If you just look at it and try and find it, you'll see good solutions to given problems, because no matter whether it's a Formula One car or other things, there's a solution to the problem that's being generated by somebody. That's been focused on that individual direction for a long time. Take simple things like nuts and bolts and washers and tie wraps and, all of that stuff. They're just off-the-shelf componentry as such. You can all make your own and spend 10 times the money on it. But going back to the sort of question, really, I think the most simple example, I think, is whenever we got to the quick fasters for the nose, back in the early 90s, the first thing I looked at was from a flat pack furniture manufacturer, and the over-center clips they have for pulling the units together. I thought, a bigger and beefier one of those would be pretty good. So, took one into the drawing office and said, draw that out and then explode it by, 100% or whatever, make it a bit bigger and a bit beefier, and let's give it a shot on the nose to try to get a quick release on the nose attachment. So, as I say, it's not necessarily the same idea for the same thing, but you know, it's all out there somewhere along the line that you can get a solution to a given problem if you just look hard enough. Because, as I say, everybody is trying to solve a problem of some sort, and some people are focused on a small problem, whereas obviously Formula One cars, you've got a huge amount of problems. But it's still, you know, there's still nuts and bolts that hold it all together. And as I say, the nose fastening was one of the typical examples. They're much more elaborate nowadays and cost, you know, 100 times as much. But that's where the sort of family of that sort of thing started.
Yeah, there's a little bit less what you might call homespun solutions now, isn't there? And obviously everything's pretty much purpose made, and you've got to be a little bit careful now as well, because anything you put on the car is covered by the cost cap and that kind of thing. But I'm sure if you looked under the skin of it, as with any racing car, there's always some cable ties or Jubilee clips or equivalents or tape somewhere, isn't there, for things? Yeah. Sometimes you do things like that. I'm sure you see that in some of the modern cars, particularly if they're trying to, you know, tweak the heat shielding and that kind of thing, and you have, you know, even down to just having blanking on cooling sometimes and that kind of thing.
Yeah, blanking on cooling, blanking on brake ducts. It's a bit of duct tape, as we call it. It's pretty elaborate duct tape, but it's still duct tape, and you'll see the teams taping up the body joints, the body lines to stop to reduce the little sort of trip edges that might be there, but also to seal them and keep the internal flow and the external flow separated. That's all just, you know, a roll of tape, helicopter tape as it's called. It's see-through because you don't want to put a bit of, you know, black tape on a coloured car. So it's see-through tape so that it's, you know, you see the sponsors underneath it or the colour scheme underneath it. So there's a huge amount of stuff that's there. It's still just commercially available stuff. You know, nuts, bolts, as I say, are the typical example. There's hundreds of them in a race car.
The next question comes from Robert O, who says, would going to small capacity engines powered by biofuels but allowing the freedom for teams and manufacturers to develop their own hybrid systems be a better engine formula? With a hybrid system, one rule would be that the hybrid system can only help to reduce fuel consumption rather than give an increase in horsepower. This to me would be beneficial in reducing environmental impact, giving new ideas to companies out there to help develop technology with real world benefit, while also the advantage of using less fuel means reducing weight, giving a huge advantage to the team that develops the most efficient hybrid system. I think what Porsche has developed with a 919 is a way forward, for example. What do you think, Gary?
Well, I think we've got to be a little bit careful, because one of the suggestions there is that companies developing it would be a real world benefit. I agree with that. Whilst the advantage of using less fuel means reducing weight, I don't think that works. You know, any hybrid system that you've got is less efficient than the fuel that you're putting into an engine. I do agree with the biofuels. High revving, small capacity engines, yes, that would, you know, again, bring back noise, and it would be great stuff. But also allowing the teams to develop their own hybrid system sounds like a license to print money. Now, you could say the cost cap would control that to a certain extent. Or you could say that you've got this box and your hybrid system has to fit into it and it has to weigh no more than this. It's just how you draw that equivalence formula between what power your engine could manufacture relative to what power your engine can manufacture plus the power from the hybrid system when you hit the go button. I think it's very easy to get things too complicated, and I don't think that Formula One and its hybrid systems actually transfer to road car technology. It's just too expensive, basically. I mean, the sort of the thought path might be quite sensible, but I think you're still looking at what Formula One would do as becoming part of an exotic car package. Again, like maybe Porsche might use it, or Lamborghini, or Ferrari, or whoever. Or use a derivative of it. But I don't think you could sort of pass that through to your Toyota Prius or whatever. You know, it's a whole different world, to be honest. And I think you got to get very careful with change. I believe that there should be less fuel. We have a fuel capacity formula now, and there's no reason why that shouldn't be reduced year on year. But we don't want to get back to the days of, you know, the lead driver having to putt around for the last 2 laps because he's just running out of fuel because he used too much to begin with. So I think the fuel flow strategy, or the fuel per lap usage, is a decent thing if that was controlled properly. If you've got a whatever distance race, 50 laps or something, each time you can use X amount of fuel per lap. So in other words, there's no sense in trying to use lots of fuel to begin with because you're not allowed to, and not have any fuel left at the end of it because you've run out. So you need to be very careful with the regulations again. I don't think they're bad the way they are. I don't like the idea of upping the hybrid and reducing the power of the engine because, again, it's not what we should be trying to do, I suppose. I think we should be trying to make the cars use less fuel, as suggested there by Robert. It's one of those sort of difficult things to really draw the line, though, and say what's the right direction. Electric cars, they've come, and there's lots of them out there now, but I'm not sure it's going to be the future. There's something else going to come along pretty soon, I think, that will outweigh the fact that you've got these trillions and billions of batteries that are going to need changing, sorting out. Where are they all going to go? And it's the environment. Whenever you start to talk about it, that's going to be a massive environmental problem. So maybe it needs a little bit more time before that sort of rears its ugly head, but it's coming.
And the final question for today comes from Audran Lanou, who says, I'm an R&D engineer working on motorisation for electric street sweepers in Belgium. What are all the modifications that the teams make when they race in the rain in terms of softer settings, modified aero, engine map, etc.? With the current generation, how do they find the right balance of ride height with standing water? And finally, while we know that Max Verstappen is extraordinary in the rain, other great drivers such as Fernando Alonso crashed in Brazil, while Max Verstappen seemed to be able to play with the Red Bull. Could this also have something to do with the setup? We've touched on this already, but wet setups aren't what they used to be, are they? They don't change as much as they once would have done. But there's certainly differences, aren't there, in terms of what kind of characteristics you can get, and you can lock yourself into a problematic place with your setup choices in the wet.
Yes, you can. It's a good question, though, because at the end of the day, it's about what you believe, how well you believe in the weather forecast. You can't put all your package together in one direction if the weather forecast is a little bit questionable. Now, it didn't seem to be too questionable in Brazil, so I wouldn't have been surprised if, Red Bull going into the qualifying session maybe had the car, unknowing that Max was going to start down the grid because of his 5-place penalty. Maybe had the car a little bit softer and a little bit higher, just to not compromise themselves too much. But you'll be talking little bits. You'll have a little bit of more downforce if you can. You will run less front balance, less front aero load for the wet, because you don't want the car to be nervous in the rear. So as far as that's concerned, it would all be small percentage stuff that changes besides what it used to be. You used to do big percentage changes for the wet. But now with Parc Fermé and that, after qualifying, you can't really do very much. So you have to commit to a setup. Normally you would commit to the dry setup. As I say, if there was a choice of springs of maybe 5% softer, you would probably go in the 5% softer range. And that the only thing you can really adjust is the front wing. But the big thing that, we see from the drivers that were really good is the feel for the car. They need a car that's balanced, and they need a car that gives them good feedback. And I think that's what Max was exceptional in Brazil. And the thing I'd like to say here is that, Lewis Hamilton, in my opinion, for many, many years was one of the best in that situation. And at the moment, in Brazil, he wasn't. So it's a very strange thing, because to lose that sort of ability to feel the car in the wet better than most others, the car must be horrible. It must have a balance change that's horrendous. But George Russell did okay in theoretically the same car. So where do you make those assumptions? It's very difficult to actually know what's the car and what's the driver. But I think as far as setup's concerned, the changes are small percentage changes, other than maybe piling on a little bit more downforce. Obviously, any engine maps you've got, power delivery maps, and that you can weaken them a little bit or smooth them a little bit, but they're still there. So, yeah, it's still a lot down to the driver, but he does need a decent balanced car on a given race day.
Well, thanks very much for those answers, Gary. Some very good questions there. If you'd like to send in a question, send it through to podcasts@therace.com. We will reconvene. When will it be? It'll be before the final triple header, won't it? Because there's a 2-week gap, so we can look ahead to the Las Vegas, Qatar, Abu Dhabi triple. Well, thanks everyone. Join us again for more from Gary.
The Athletic.